This is National Public Radio News from Washington.
I'm reminding people that she was Madonna before the other Madonna was Madonna. And though she may not be as widely known by the general public as her counterpart, Madonna Kolbenschlag may well have in the long run a more serious claim to fame around things that matter. An internationally known author and lecturer, sometime consultant to Congress on public policy and religious affairs, and a practicing psychotherapist and research associate at the University of West Virginia, she's probably best known for her groundbreaking study of fairy tales, Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, which has already been, or is being currently translated into several languages. The book's subtitle, Breaking the Spell of Feminine Myths and Models, may partly explain the widespread interest that has kept it in print since it first appeared in 1979. What was rather unexpected, however, was the tremendous interest it would have for third world women, a development that's both surprised and delighted Kolbenschlag. Born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, where she still has family, Madonna Kolbenschlag has held the title of Professor of American Studies and Women's Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the AMUW Chair in Humanistic Studies at Marquette University, and the position of Senior Fellow at the Washington, D.C. Woodstock Theological Center. She's been invited to speak all over the world on such related issues as women's development, public policy, and spirituality. And she has some fascinating insights into the plight and the future of women in the developing world. Madonna Kolbenschlag has also written or edited 3 other important books since 1979, but none has quite matched the impact of Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye. I asked her how she explains the enduring popularity and seemingly ever-expanding appeal of that book.
I think these particular stories, and we're talking about Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Cinderella, Goldilocks, Beauty and the Beast, those are the big ones. These particular stories capture universal themes. And interestingly enough, like a story like Cinderella has about 345 variants in different cultures. That you would even find a few in Africa, in Asia, so that the myths that they represent, the archetypal stories, if you will, are very universal. What I have done with them is to point out that not only are the original stories very universal and archetypal, but the myths that underlie the stories are classic representations of the role of women as it has been given to us, as we have been, let's say, programmed, socialized by the culture. And we're growing out of that now. For instance, the Sleeping Beauty myth or story more or less describes the female as one who indeed must wait for the male who's going to rescue her and give her her real life, and therefore setting up in the female the idea of a need for male approval that is kind of overarching. Well, women are coming out of that now. They're looking for their meaning in life, not only from a relationship and a partner, but also looking inside themselves to see what their inner resources are. Or Snow White, which is the classic, women will inevitably do each other in. That's something that we've been programmed to think, too, and it's simply not true.
Yeah, in that story, of course, it is the queen's jealousy. She wants to be the fairest one of all. I mean, it's this kind of contention between women to be the fairest, to be the most beautiful, the center of attraction, right? And that is a story, a myth, if you will, that has been passed down.
Now, it's very clear that as women emerge in society, we will become engaged in power struggles. If we are fully human, that will be a possibility. But that there is something embedded in us that is going to compete for other women to be the object of someone's affection, that is not necessarily inevitable. And I think those are the kind of, how shall I say, tapes that have been put in our heads by the culture that we're really getting rid of.
Now, these stories, many of them were collected by the Brothers Grimm in the early 19th century, when there was a great burgeoning interest in folk tales of individual cultures, in the roots of all these European cultures. I think you note somewhere in the book that something like a third of these stories were gathered from a single source, a woman called Alta Maria.
Right.
And you note that these stories were generally told by the mothers or grandmothers, the female caretakers of the children. So, in fact, it was women all these years who were passing along these archetypes. Why did they do that?
Well, they were very much in their origin prescriptions for behavior. And that was why so many of the fairy tales in general encompass elements of fear and elements of struggle, elements of testing. In other words, if you are good and behave a certain way and, struggle through these things, then you will be rescued at the end.
But, of course, as you note, in these stories, there was always a pretty clear line between who was doing the rescuing and who got rescued.
Right.
And that happened to fall along gender lines.
It did, and one of the things that interests me a great deal that I began to explore in the book that is sort of a follow-up to this, Lost in the Land of Oz, I began to be interested in the fairy tales that dropped out, that were left on the cutting room floor, as it were. And you can find them, they're still out there, but many of them have been lost or submerged.
You mean the folklore collectors, such as the Brothers Grimm, edited their collections, deliberately did not include some in the canon, as it were?
I think not only did the storytellers, but I'm certain that the Brothers Grimm had a kind of built-in selection process. I think anyone who writes does, anyone who collects does. It's inevitable, and I think it would have been very natural to select the ones that were the most popular because they were indeed being edited by the culture, which are the ones that are the real messages that our culture is conveying. And so a lot of stories that might not have conveyed those messages so strongly, or where the message was inverted, were either submerged or lost, and certainly did not reach the prominence that the fairy tales that we have mentioned have.
So these old women and the mothers, the female caretakers who told these stories, and it was an oral tradition, there were no children's storybooks back in those days, I suppose, also told their charges, little boys and little girls, other kinds of stories, and those have been lost. That's what you're saying?
I'm saying that probably a great many of those were lost, but they may not have told them, and that may be why they were lost. They may not have known them themselves. For example, it may be a cultural thing. Western Europe obviously focused on some of the tales and popularized those. On the other hand, the Native American culture has its own tales, and many of them are very different from these. And of course, we know that many Native American cultures were more woman-centered, or at least had a great deal more respect for feminine values. And I think that's the key, that what we're seeing here are kind of little mirrors that reflect the way that a particular culture valued certain themes or representations of human behavior or acting or believing that were indigenous to that culture.
So these stories that most of us grew up with, and I say us in the limited sense of those Americans of mostly European background, in the acknowledgement that there are many other kinds of Americans as well. But let's say you and I grew up with Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Cinderella, Goldilocks, Beauty and the Beast. These were all very distinctly stories of European origin, which represent, among other things, a kind of Eurocentric view of things. And yet, your experience has been that women in other cultures, even third world cultures around the world, identify here, find points of connection with these stories.
Yes. I think these stories are very relevant to cultures that are in the process of developing, because the women in those cultures inevitably run up against that conflict of values and so on that we have experienced certainly here. I also think that, as I pointed out before, that these particular tales do have variants in many cultures, probably for that reason, that they do address issues that are relevant to a certain threshold of development. And the Euro-American character that many of them have is certainly, part of the reason that they're still popular. We forget also the impact of the emerging universal popular culture, of which Disney is part, and all kinds of other reproducing mechanisms that have made these particular figures more popular than they would have been. Not necessarily in their original version.
But if the women in Japan didn't already know the story of Sleeping Beauty or the story of Snow White, they do now, right? They've seen the Disney version.
Yes, but I also think that, as I've discovered, that they do have variants of some of these stories. Not all, but some of them are very relevant. For example, the Japanese culture is an extremely patriarchal culture. So stories that relate to characters like Sleeping Beauty, characters like Cinderella, are very likely to exist in the Asian or certainly the Japanese culture, I would think. So I think we would be more likely to find variants in patriarchal cultures of stories like Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella. I think it would be less likely to find a story like Goldilocks, which did originate later and in the Anglo-Saxon culture as it was in a process of development, which was a later stage than some of the others originated.
Well, you see Goldilocks as a kind of metaphor or myth about the search for the perfect family.
And I follow that up in my next book, Lost in the Land of Oz, with the idea of the self as destined to be orphaned. And the orphan goes in search of the perfect family, the perfect relationship, and so on, and eventually discovers that there is probably nothing perfect, and then reaches a kind of spiritual plateau in which one can integrate the failure of the ideal with the befriending of those parts of life and of ourselves that are not so ideal.
But even in stories like Cinderella and Snow White, you also have the theme of the family. Snow White is adopted into this family, as it were, of little men, and Cinderella has to deal with her stepsisters and wicked stepmother.
Obviously, you can see the connection that these stories have with caretakers and siblings and families. That's where they originated. They did not originate in the higher realms of art, so to speak, but in the basic experience of the people within family units and within sibling relationships especially.
And those stories spoke and speak to the anxieties of children faced with, let's say, a stepmother or a blended family. I guess back even in those days, we had stepbrothers and stepsisters, and had to deal with the fact that you had to suddenly share your father's love or your mother's love, and all these kinds of things that children worry and agonize about sometimes.
There's a great deal, I think, about loss embedded in these fairy tales, and if you think about the life expectancy, which was much shorter, it would not be unusual for a child to lose one or the other parent quite early and have to then blend with another family, or another person might be coming in, or they might actually be shuttled out to another family, as often, the young people were. So that it speaks to their experience, but it also captures on a more perhaps unconscious level, anxieties, fears that all children have in whatever culture, I think. And these are the stuff of nightmares.
Mm. As a matter of fact, sleep itself seems to be a rather recurring theme in some of these stories. Sleeping Beauty lies waiting to be awakened by her prince, as does Snow White. Do you see any special significance in the image or the metaphor of the sleeping adolescent girl?
I think that's a fascinating question, and one that I'm sure I'll think about after this interview is over. But I think for me, what I, sort of focused on, what came through to me about the sleep images in so many of the fairy tales, it's either sleep or it's a spell that's been cast, is the idea then of a consciousness awakening to reality, but also to its true self. And I think that for me that became a wonderful metaphor for the whole experience that we are going through in our times, which I think is the most important change on the face of the earth for eons, and that is the consciousness change that is going on in women, which is universal. You'll find it in every culture, but starting at a different point, in a different place, for different reasons often. But it is probably the most universal change that is going on in our times.
If you've just joined us, my guest is Madonna Kolbenschlag, the author of Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, Breaking the Spell of Feminine Myths and Models. First published in 1979, it has since been reissued in a new edition with an epilogue by the author, and of special interest to me, translated into several different languages. How many languages and which ones has the book been translated into so far?
So far, there was a special edition for Great Britain and Ireland. Some parts of some of my writing have been translated into Japanese, and Kiss Sleeping Beauty is being considered at the moment for Japanese, along with the other writings which have already been translated. I was rather surprised, I think, that there would be as much interest in the book in Asia as there is. Chinese and Spanish contracts have been signed to translate that within a 2-year period. They should be out too. The first Latin American edition of my book was actually in Portuguese for Brazil. The publishers there tell me that the first editions sold out almost immediately, and they were delighted because it seems to be very popular there. The Spanish edition, which is underway right now, I'm very excited about that because that will certainly reach the rest of Latin America and hopefully other places, since it's a worldwide Spanish translation.
You've spent some time in Latin America. You've spoken, lectured there, and I understand that was a rather formative experience in your life, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed it was. I've, had connections with several countries for any number of reasons, and the most satisfying has been the work that I've been able to do in connecting with women in several countries. I was recently visited by a woman from the Philippines who went quite a bit out of her way to catch up with me, and then proceeded to inform me that my books have had, especially Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, has had quite an influence in the Philippines, and I was delighted to hear that. And of course many people in the Philippines read English, so much of it was through the English language, but it will circulate in other languages too, probably eventually.
How has its influence been felt? What sort of impact has it had?
She explained that very well. Her name was Shari Lucero, and she herself is a writer. And my book, as well as other influences, were helpful as Philippine women were in the process of being part of a culture that was developing and moving more in the direction of self-determination. And there was a parallel movement going on in women, which is usually true. And we've seen that, written on the world stage. She herself has done something in the same vein. She formed a collective of writers who write romances which appeal to people of every level of experience and education, not just those who are privileged and educated. The concern of their collective was that how do we reach women who are not privy to books, or the typical kind of book that Kiss Sleeping Beauty represents, which is usually read by a fairly educated person, literate person. They realized that most women, and we see it here in the grocery stores, pick up romance magazines from wherever and tales of that sort. So they have formed a collective in which they are writing these kinds of stories, popular culture for women, but the stories have taken the myths that are embedded in the conventional stories and they're turning them upside down. In other words, helping women to see themselves differently and reaching women at a socioeconomic level that would probably not be reading my book, which I think is terribly exciting.
How important is it, in your view, to get to women and effect some sort of fundamental change in their lives and in their circumstances as far as the future of many developing countries goes?
A philosopher once said something that I truly believe myself and have seen over and over again, I think, in the history of cultures or the experience of cultures, and that is that the key to evolution is an insurrection of subjugated knowledges. And those are big words for the fact that the future is always embedded in those who have not had self-determination, who've been in the shadow or been pushed to the periphery, been devalued. And what we see in women is the largest group of people who have the experience of being a subjugated element in the culture. Those elements, those sectors, minorities are also part of this, but women are the largest group. They have knowledge. They gain experience that the privileged sector does not have. And while the privileged sector, which is dominantly white and male in the culture, has over the past centuries built up this culture, civilization that we have today, a very technological, organized civilization. Now we're finding that some of the very technology and organization and power orders that we have organized, the money order, for example, these are all becoming dysfunctional. And so we're looking now to the subjugated knowledges. What is it that women have learned over the centuries that might have the seed of the future? For example, because women did not have physical strength, they learned better than men how to negotiate to get something accomplished. They learned better how to cooperate. They learned, because they had to take care of children and learn the arts of caretaking, they seem to have a powerful sense of what social priorities should be and how to accomplish them, where to put the emphasis. So that if we examine the experience of women, even in their kinship with each other, they have created over the eons stronger bonds that last for a lifetime compared to the bonds between men, which are ordinarily looser. So that there are things that we are going to need for the future that we can find in the experience of women. And that is precisely what happens in a developing culture, I think.
Yeah, and gosh, you think of all that pent-up energy and unrealized and untapped potential And I can see where releasing that would be a key to the future of the developing world.
Yeah.
But women, of course, in most of these developing countries, tend not to control the means of production, the economy, the money, and so forth. And isn't it true that traditionally a lot of the foreign aid programs that have reached into those countries to try to turn things around have in fact focused on the men and on the training of the men?
Mm-hmm. I think that is a very, perceptive observation that is of great concern to people in public policy areas today. It certainly concerns me. I'm currently a women's commissioner for the state of West Virginia, and we think about this a lot because the state of West Virginia, for example, the population of women is growing astronomically by comparison with the population of men, and particularly in the older age groups. And so what does it mean that public policy neglects women and focuses on men? A man from one of the directors of the World Bank that I have contact with through some of my international work told me that he said, we finally realized that we have to focus development aid on women or nothing is ever going to change. Because what they have discovered, and this is true not only the World Bank, who are finding it out a little belatedly, but of many, many women's groups have been saying this for some time, that women are greater multipliers. For example, if you invest in a country that's underdeveloped, and the training and the investment money and so forth, the resources focus on the males, the tendency is that when the males become developed, they tend to take the profits for themselves and they purchase items that are produced elsewhere. All of a sudden, the man who's now got cash crops appears with a wristwatch or a motorcycle or whatever. But they have discovered that if they invest in women, then the women tend to keep the money or the profits focused on the family, the local community. And it tends to go into not these types of commercial luxuries. They tend to be invested in things like education and health and children. And they tend also to do more with cooperative types of structures, whereas the individualistic element tends to take hold in the male culture. Now, some will say, oh, now that can't be true, but it is evidently universally true, or at least there's a tendency to that. And so we are now talking about, in public policy, doing gender analysis in order to find out who is getting the lion's share of the resources or aid that is going, and if it turns out that it's lopsided, to at least give women an equal share. If in some international organizations are saying we have to focus most of it on women because that's how the community then develops.
Yeah, you mentioned their tendency to move into cooperative ventures or projects. And by their nature, of course, cooperative enterprises tend to bring about a kind of synergy. You don't they? You end up with somehow more energy than you put in the first place. The sum is greater than the parts because people energize each other and other people's potential begins to explode forth.
And this is precisely why the Grameen Bank in India, the village banks, have been so successful. I spoke to one of their directors who told me that they prefer women because they find that when the women form the cooperative, they get a 99.9 return on their loans. That is not the case when it has been a cooperative that involves men. So there's a track record that indicates that investing in women is a very wise thing.
Well, a man has to have his pint at the end of the day, right, as they say. And one thing tends to lead to another. You see that all too often, don't you?
The secret of the village bank concept is certainly the idea that the loan is shared and paid back, and only after a loan to one is paid back can another one in the group get a loan, so that they depend on each other, and they have to cooperate, they have to share, and they have to delay sometimes, personal gratification and think of the group. Also, with the Grameen Bank, there is a social program that goes with it. And if you commit yourself to that, you also are committing yourself, as many Bangladesh women or Indian women are, to educating your children and a whole set of principles that ensure that the next generation will be starting at a different point.
We come back to your book about the fairy tales so many of us grew up with. And again, the idea that many of those stories involve a kind of transformation, don't they? That somebody moves from one state to another. And of course, it's always a question of how that happens, what the agent or who the agent of that transformation is. And so is part of the appeal of these books then in these other cultures around the world the idea that these women too yearn for a kind of transformation in their state of life?
Yes, I think you've hit the core of what appeals in the fairy tale, which I think truly is the idea of transformation. Fairy tales are full of transformations, of frogs into men and balls into angels and so on. And essentially, I think it represents our spiritual aspiration. What does our existence mean? Above all, if we pursue that question, it means that I can grow, that I can be transformed, I can be more than I am today. And the soul is the essence of fairy tale, the pursuit of soul, the pursuit of my spiritual transformation. It's probably the most powerful literature that we know of at a certain time in our lives.
Besides Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, you've written a lot about women over the years, books and articles. What do you think is the larger meaning of your work?
That's a good question, and I think I would answer that by saying that I think the larger issue that concerns me is the repression of a whole value system that we have no other word for than feminine right now. If the time comes when, as a culture, we have integrated all those values, we would no longer have to call them feminine values. But I think right now people know what we mean by that. Caring for others, vulnerability, a whole series of feminine-related experiences that have been repressed by the dominant culture. And I think that is the denigrated, despised part of the individual self also. Certainly in the work that I do as a therapist with men, the secret of their recovery and transformation is often the recovery of the lost feminine part of themselves that has been diminished, in their own personal lives. I also think that I was reminded of this by the State Department report on the state of human rights for women globally, and it is painful to read this recitation of the wrongs to women. It seems as if nothing has happened. I think things are happening. And the very fact that we have a report like this that now focuses on women tells us that we're now realizing that it's important that half of our culture be freed and be allowed to develop. And so I think those are the two larger meanings, both a cultural meaning and at the very personal level. We have all, women included, denigrated those values in ourselves We have internalized the values of a system of dominance, and we have to unlearn that. And I think that's really what my work is all about.
Madonna Kolbenschlag, thanks for talking with us.
It was delightful. Thank you, Dennis. It's nice to be back in Cleveland.
Madonna Kolbenschlag is an internationally known writer and lecturer on women's development and spirituality, public policy, and gender-related issues. A practicing psychotherapist and research associate at the University of West Virginia, she's a member of the religious community of the Sisters of the Humility of Mary, based at Villa Maria, Pennsylvania. Her book, Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, has been twice reissued since it first appeared in 1979. The first Portuguese edition appeared in Brazil in 1991 and almost immediately sold out. Burgeoning interest in Kolbenschlag's writings among men and women in the developing world has since led to Spanish, Chinese, and Japanese translations of Kiss Sleeping Beauty Goodbye, which are now in progress. Kolbenschlag's most recent book, Lost in the Land of Oz, published by Harper & Row, turns the powerful lens of her intelligence on contemporary social myths and their impact on human psychology, politics, and the religious experience. That's it for this morning's After 9. Glad you could join us. Incidentally, I hope you'll join me again tomorrow afternoon at 3 when we present an hour-long documentary I had the pleasure of producing and narrating on the Cleveland Playhouse's historic tour last summer to the ancient capitals of Prague and Bratislava.